Good morning. This is Axel Merk, President and Chief Investment Officer of Merck Investments. Happy Monday. Hope everybody had a wonderful, isolating weekend here. Starting the week, starting off the week with a quote unquote risk-off sentiment, and around the world, equity markets were quote unquote catching down. Um, Here, the Euro Stoxx 50, for example, is down 3.8% today. On Friday, several markets were closed around the world because of the Labor Day holiday around the world. The FTSE flattish, they were open, I suppose. The CAC 40, the French index, is down 4%, the DAX 3.6%. And Nikkei was down 2.8%, the Hong Kong index 4.8%. But in China, I have here the CSI 300 was up 1%. In the US, the S&P futures are down 10.5%, and the Nasdaq is actually up right now on my screen, up $30, so that's interesting. The bonds around the world were generally weaker, so that's usually you have the bonds stronger when you have a risk-off environment. You have, my Bloomberg is a little slow here. UK, the bonds are stronger by half a point. But generally speaking, throughout the Eurozone, bonds are weaker, and in Australia, the bonds are stronger. The 10-year is at 64 basis points right now, and that's down 10 ticks. The long one is down a full point and 2 ticks. That's interesting. The 4-week T-bill is at 9 basis points, and I've been mentioning those short-term rates because just to monitor them, the T-bill rate, of course, doesn't change so much. Similarly, the Fed funds rate, the effective one, is at 4 basis points, but the 3-month LIBOR has come down to 54 basis points. So that spread has been narrowing, and now it's still elevated, but no longer quite as much in crisis territory, so to speak. Spot gold is now up 40 basis points, up 7.5 points at 1708, and the gold futures are up 14.5 at 1715. And that's after low we had earlier this morning. The gold was weaker, so that's coming back a tad here. What's happening around the world? Lots of talk about easing of restrictions, and the one thing I hear more of is people not adhering to the guidelines, and people, as in not just individuals, but also regions. In California, where I'm based, for example, 2 counties have pretty much said they will not obey Governor Newsom's orders. They say that their counties have very few cases, and therefore they can open up restrictions more. At the other end of the spectrum, Governor Newsom apparently indicated he'll ease things up a little bit more in the coming days, and Los Angeles County, where cases are worse, they said they're not going to go so fast. And so in some ways, that's just based on the localities. A town west of Albuquerque, New Mexico, apparently they have gone on lockdown, not allowing anybody in and out because they have a lot of cases. And so there's obviously regional differences. The politics of it all is also coming more to light. There was a report on public radio over the weekend how a Latin American woman was interviewed that she was sick, went to the doctor, was told there wasn't a test available. This is several weeks ago. Continued going to work, and then some others in her family has gotten sick. The emphasis appeared to be really mostly on the fact that there was no test available. The fact that she went back to work was really not mentioned. I do know some cases personally, very similar situation, where they had symptoms, only light symptoms, not even the typical symptoms, but decided not to go to work anymore. And this particular person I'm referring to is working in a restaurant. Luckily had a place to stay, but did the right thing and didn't go to work. I mean, part of the big issue is, of course, that the person who was working in a restaurant, a friend of mine, also doesn't have health insurance, but then decided to do the right thing. I say also because the person who was interviewed at least lived in a community where many do not have health insurance, and that, of course, does create different outcomes in compared to some other countries where health insurance is more widely available and unemployment insurance. In this case, in the US, has kicked in as well, but a lot of people have gone back to work with symptoms here, and so that obviously has had ripple effects. By now, I would hope that the message has gotten through that when you're sick, you don't go back to work, I suppose, and then most people don't work anyway. But that's part of the reason why you use the sledgehammer approach. And now, of course, in the tail end, hopefully on things, or I don't know whether tail end is the right word. There might be some more differentiated approaches, but even in Germany, where everything is like clockwork and everything is so precise, they're starting to have some disagreements, some disputes about how to proceed, um, they on the positive side, Roche, the Swiss pharmaceutical company, is apparently days away from having an antibody test. And since I mentioned a company name, let me take that opportunity to put in some disclosure. Obviously, not making an investment recommendation on the company or any company for that matter in a public setting like this. But as many are aware, there's over a dozen of these antibody tests around, and at least the CEO of Roche the other day said that most of them are crap. I think that while that may not be a technical term, I think that's right to the point of it, that it's very inaccurate. And if you get the antibody test and you don't know which one it is, you have no idea how accurate it is. And and there are still several glitches here. Here in the US, you can get a test by Quest, the largest testing center, I believe they are in the US, and at least as of a few days ago, they didn't say which of the tests they were using, and in part presumably because they want to keep flexibility as to which test they're using. But as a consumer, I would like to have these tests available, and that's really key to a more normalized life. On talking about, since I'm wearing my medical hat here. Over the weekend, I learned that the tracing software that Apple is working on, at least, does not use a centralized database. And so I mentioned last week or so that Australia was deploying a program, and they had some guidelines as to who has access to the data. Well, in the Apple model, nobody has access to the data except for you on your cell phone. And so it is technically possible that you just know who you have been in touch with, or that whether you have been in touch with somebody who has been infected without anybody else knowing about it. And so from a privacy point of view, that appears to address many of the concerns. Um, in Europe, they have a discussion whether they can trust an American company taking care of things, right? And let's say they don't want the technology to go to the US. Well, you have the tech leaders in the US, and that are probably German engineers at Apple doing these things, right? I mean, the politics is coming through in various places. In Australia, it's the Amazon cloud. It's a domestic, meaning domestic to Australia, Amazon cloud where the data is hosted. But those are the sort of political questions that come up with when you have these sort of tracing things, as you have privacy protected, you store the data in the country and whatnot. But storing it on the phone, on your own phone, and having nobody else have access to it, I think it's like a pretty cool idea to me. So you can then judge yourself as to what you want to do and how to proceed with that. In the meantime, I'm getting messages from our office building that they're working on solutions and so forth. I mean, that the challenge is to use an elevator, right? And how do you make sure everybody gets up? If nobody shows back up at work, then obviously it's easy. I'm not going to have an issue because working East Coast hours on the West Coast, I rarely ever step into the elevator during quote unquote rush hour, which is 9 a.m., noon, and 5 p.m. It's easy enough to avoid those times. But we have a service elevator, by the way, in our office building that anybody there's always a construction in a high rise somewhere. And sometimes the workers keep the door open, and you literally have to wait 10, 20 minutes before the elevator comes so you can take another floor, because for 44 floors, I believe it is one elevator for everybody who is required to use that. And basically, don't, if you have work clothing, as in getting your hands dirty type of clothing, you're supposed to use that elevator. Good. Other than that, the loonie is now the strongest currency. If I look at the board, it was the yen earlier. It's the only currency up in the G10, up 4 basis points. The yen kind of flattish. The weakest currency is the Norwegian krone, down 90 basis points. And then let me do, I take some notes here, and watching these various screens and talking at the same time. It's not always easy to do at the same time. But yeah, one of the other things that was out over the weekend is a poll that, for the Democrats at least, Elizabeth Warren is the favorite vice presidential candidate. And it's going to be very important, very interesting to see who Biden chooses. In some of the surveys, I'm not so sure whether I've quoted them on this thing here. I tend to watch the prediction markets, the betting markets as to who the markets favors winning. If you put money down, my assumption is people care a little bit more about giving accurate information. Now that said, these markets are very volatile with any topic, and if there's a headline out there, these markets do shift, but maybe for the right reasons. Um, and and there, if you just look at the individual candidates, there's a market. President Trump had been taking the lead on that, and actually, I might well just pull that up as I talk. Um, there currently is, if there's 49 cents are bet on Donald Trump out of a dollar, and 43 cents are bet on Biden. So that one suggests that Donald Trump is in the lead. But there's another market going on, which party is going to have the president, and that has been neck on neck, and at many times the Democrats leading. So you do with that as you wish, right? But the question to me is kind of who will be the vice presidential candidate, and I don't have it here at my fingertips here. But the reason it matters is obviously not just for the president, but also for the kind of the contender, Biden, presumably. They're both up there in age, and so the vice president may matter more when you have both parties have a candidate for president that are not the youngest anymore, and several of the vice presidential people in play for Biden are much further to the left than Biden is. And so obviously the goal for the Democrats is to quote unquote just win, but policy does matter. Ultimately, I get asked frequently, oh, well, if this person wins or that person wins, what does it mean for the markets? I think it really matters what Congress will look like, because when you have gridlock, as is often the case, then you don't get as much done except for on the executive order sides. And while that might be exhausting to watch how the executive power is used on things, and then the next president changes it all again, doesn't change as much the fabric of a country as when you do change the laws and then put things really on a different track. And so we'll have to see how that's going to play out. Um, Then one other item this morning on Bloomberg, I heard about the breadth of the market with last year. And then they talked about the S&P and the Dow and so forth. Breadth is, and then they talked about volatility and in some areas. Breadth of the market is one has to differentiate that, and depth. When you place large orders, how much does that move? And I think we're still in the area where, with fairly little money, all relatively speaking, obviously, you can impact markets quite a bit. Anyway, at the end of the week, we have the non-farm payroll report, expecting completely devastating numbers. It's obviously quote unquote priced in, presumably, and that will be the low point. And if you're a glass half full person, then we can go up from there. I mean, the question ultimately is, of course, how is this all going to play out? And we don't have a crystal ball. Nobody has a crystal ball. The Over the weekend, we heard Warren Buffett saying, oh, he dumped his airline stocks. Again, no investment recommendation here. Warren Buffett, if I understand him correctly, he loves to buy stuff that generates cash flow. And the airlines will not for an extended period. I mean, airlines are a notoriously cyclical business, and this is kind of the extreme of all that. And who knows whether they'll survive. At the same time, he's been in the news as to his company Berkshire Hathaway as to why they haven't made any acquisitions. And the consensus for the most part is that the Fed has beat them to the punch, with the Fed providing liquidity. And the question is it right to kind of sidestep the private sector as much? Obviously, you get fantastic deals if you have the cash available to step in during the tough times. But if the Fed kind of eats your lunch, if that's your business model, you step in on the few occasions when all hell breaks loose, there will be fewer. There, you provide a disincentive to have a cash buffer. You provide a disincentive to be that angel, and so that means in the next crisis we'll be even more dependent on the bailouts from the Fed. And I don't know whether that's so healthy. Now, I sympathize as to why that's been happening, but I do think it is concerning to set these sort of disincentives in place here. The other thing, of course, that some people say that, well, maybe he's just looking for better value still. And of course, there is some of that, right? Because last week somebody on Bloomberg was asked, well, at what price should the big oil companies gobble up some of these fracking companies? And the answer was pretty much, well, they should wait until these things are completely bust. Why why overpay, right? This stuff is going to get even cheaper if they run against the wall. So maybe, so there will certainly be some great quote unquote deals to be had at some point. But the dynamics with the government being the lender of first resort are truly changing here a little bit. Good. So let me leave it at this then for today. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you in a bit. Talk to you tomorrow, probably. Take care.